From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Jason Steinhauer, and I'm a program specialist at the John W. Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. On behalf of Dr. Carolyn Brown, Director of the Office of Scholarly Programs, and the entire Kluge Center staff, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's program. Before we begin, please take a moment to check your cell phones and other electronic devices, and please set them to silent. Thank you. I'll also make you aware that this afternoon's program is being filmed for future broadcast on the Library of Congress website, as well as our Kluge Center YouTube and iTunes channels. So I encourage you to visit these sites to watch past programs featuring hundreds of current and former scholars, including many scholars on foreign policy and international relations. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars and postdoctoral and doctoral fellows to do research in the Library of Congress collections. We also offer free public lectures, conferences, symposia, and other programs, and administer the Kluge Prize, which is a lifetime achievement for the fields of humanistic and social science studies. For more information about the Kluge Center and some of our opportunities for research, please sign our email list, which is in the back of the room when you walk in, or I guess when you walk out, to learn more about future programs and our opportunities. Today's lecture is titled Excavating Realpolitik, Real Realpolitik, a History. It is the third in a three-part series hosted by the Kluge Center and our current Kissinger Chair, Dr. John Bew, which explores what realpolitik looks like in practice as well as theory, and asks the question how relevant realpolitik is to today's international challenges. Dr. Bew's conclusion, I believe, is that it is relevant, and in a few minutes he will explain why. I was thinking about today's lecture and my introduction, and it struck me that war and conflict can do wonders for our vocabulary. Neologisms seem to go hand in hand with conflict, perhaps because instability and rupture reveals new things about the world around us and ourselves, for which, in turn, requires new words. Scholar and folklorist Louis Pound mused in 1941 about new expressions appearing in the Webster's Dictionary as a result of World War II, including all out and total. Scholar Michael Tilby suggests that 2,000 words were introduced into the French language during the time of the French Revolution. And in 1848, after a wave of bloody revolutions across Europe, another new word was born, realpolitik. And as we'll hear from John, the term was born out of a particular time and place in specific circumstances and with particular implications about how to effect liberal changes on a stubbornly authoritarian world. But as language tends to do, the term has evolved and has been adopted, appropriated, and manipulated for an array of purposes. So today, John will help us sort out this puzzle and provide us a framework for applying this sophisticated concept to our most complicated of 21st century worlds. Before I introduce John, though, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the chair position which he holds. The Kissinger Chair is made possible by the generous donations of the friends and admirers of Dr. Henry A. Kissinger. It establishes a nonpartisan focus in the nation's capital for discussion of key issues in foreign affairs and acts as a catalyst for the fresh analysis of foreign affairs in the global era. One distinguished researcher is appointed annually to be in residence at the Kluge Center and research any aspect of foreign policy or international relations involving the United States using the Library of Congress collections. Our past chairholders have included an ambassador who researched the likely evolution of the relationship between India and the United States, a member of the British Diplomatic Service who researched Pakistan's strategic culture and how it shapes U.S. foreign policy goals, and an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations who researched the growing division between European Union, NATO, and the former Soviet Union. Our 14th Kissinger Chair will be announced later this year, and we are eager to hear from you nominations for who should be our 15th Kissinger Chair. So please visit our website to learn more, and note that applications and nominations for this chair position may be submitted from now through November 1st. Finally, on to Dr. Bew. As mentioned, Dr. John Bew is the 13th chairholder of the Henry A. Kissinger in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the library's John W. Kluge Center. He is a reader in history and foreign policy at the War Studies Department at King's College and director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence. John also contributes regularly to the New Statesman and War on the Rocks, and we are grateful to both War on the Rocks and to King's College, where John teaches, for their promotional support of this three-part series. At the library, John is researching and writing a history of Anglo-American Realpolitik to be published by Oxford University Press. His prior monograph, Castlereagh, A Life, was named one of the books of the year for 2011 by the Wall Street Journal, Sunday Telegraph, The Spectator, BBC Parliament Book Talk, and Total Politics. On a personal note, the Kluge Center has benefited extraordinarily from John's presence these past 6 months. He has been a vocal advocate for the Kluge Center and the Library of Congress, and he has contributed greatly to the collegiality of the center through the mentoring of younger scholars. He wonderfully embodies the Kluge Center's core values of bringing a reflective, scholarly understanding to issues of global significance, and he epitomizes the value of deep scholarship born from the collections of our premier research libraries, such as this one. He is also, I might add, one of the least objectionable Manchester United fans I've ever met. And that may be the highest compliment that I can pay him. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. John Bew.
Thank you, Jason, for those extremely kind remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely privileged and honored to hold the Henry Kissinger Chair at the Kluge Center for 2013 and 14. And I would like to thank the Friends of Dr. Kissinger who endowed this position and the Kissinger Chair Committee for providing me with such a fantastic opportunity. A special mention must also go to the Librarian of Congress, Dr. James Billington, who has been hugely supportive and interested in my work since my arrival here last October, and to Dr. Carolyn Brown, the director of the Kluge Center, and her dynamic and committed team who support all the scholars in residence here. There is, I would suggest, no better place to do work of this nature than the Kluge Center, by which I mean research that is grounded in scholarship and makes use of this seemingly bottomless pit of resources here at the library, but also scholarship that aims to be present-minded and at least conscious of the needs of those in the Hill and other departments of state. And in fact, my main observation of my time here in DC is that there is a real appetite for history and strategy and this type of perspective when it comes to contemporary issues of foreign affairs. And if there is sometimes a distance between scholars and policymakers on matters of foreign policy, I would suggest that the fault does not necessarily lie with the latter. My research here and my lecture this afternoon begins with one word, Realpolitik, and I want to do two things with that word in the course of my remarks. The first is to excavate the real origins of Realpolitik in mid-19th century Europe. And the second is to examine how Realpolitik has been used in Anglo-American discourse about foreign affairs ever since, as a window into the soul, if you will, of the Anglo-American worldview. Much of what stands for modern Realpolitik deviates, in my view, significantly from the original meaning of the term. Nonetheless, I do believe, as Jason said already, that there is something in that original meaning which is still relevant today. So real Realpolitik may surprise, but it will also, I hope, enlighten. Now, there was a time, of course, when the very notion of an Anglo-American worldview might have been more contentious. And tomorrow, the 11th of April, is the 200th anniversary of the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which marked the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte and France after more than 20 years of warfare. Now, Britain's victory in Europe in 1914 freed her up to deal with some rather smaller troubles that were occurring in her former American colonies at that time. And a few months later, in August 1914, British redcoats flooded into Washington, D.C. and burned down the White House and also much of the Capitol, which gratefully was subsequently rebuilt. Now, I mention this in part by means of confession, in the sense that my last book was a biography of Lord Castlereagh, who was the British Foreign Secretary from 1812 to 1822, and who must therefore bear some responsibility for Britain's unforgivable actions on that day. And also, in the interest of full disclosure, I should probably also mention that the man who actually led the troops into Washington, D.C. that day, General Robert Ross, was born in exactly the same part of the world as me, in the north of Ireland, just outside Belfast, the same place, incidentally, as Lord Castlereagh. So while I speak this afternoon as a Brit, let me end by my introductory remarks with an apology for the historical wrongs committed by at least two of my troublesome forefathers from the north of Ireland. And also, on a more serious note, to submit that the notion of an Anglo-American worldview does still stand up to critical scrutiny, despite the more difficult episodes in our shared past. So the premise of my lecture today is that Realpolitik is back in fashion again. And of course, recent events in Crimea and the eastern Ukraine have been interpreted in this light. But I would suggest that Realpolitik was already undergoing a renaissance in Anglo-American political discourse before the events of the last few months. And the reasons for a return to Realpolitik are in themselves no mystery, and there's no need to recount them at length here. Suffice to say that in recent years, much of the optimism and sense of exceptionalism which crept into the Anglo-American worldview following the end of the Cold War, and even lasted into the period after 9/11, has been eroded. And the chastening experience of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the revival of great power rivalries have set the stage for what some have called the return of history and the end of dreams. We are also in the midst of one of our periodic Machiavellian moments, in which a slew of new books on Machiavellian statecraft appear, each trying to identify some kernel of wisdom which we can apply to today's problems. This time around, however, Realpolitik has some new friends, and I would say unlikely advocates. It is increasingly said that the Obama administration's approach to the world has been defined by Realpolitik, and that the president has been as realist as any of his predecessors in the conduct of foreign affairs. Last May, the German weekly Der Spiegel ran an article declaring that President Obama was the heir to Kissinger's Realpolitik, quoting the editor of the National Interest here in Washington, D.C., to the effect that the president may even start talking about foreign affairs in a German accent. Tellingly, this is a label which those in the administration have embraced. Everybody always breaks it down between idealist and realist, said Obama's former chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, in April 2010. If you had to put him in one category, he's probably more Realpolitik, like Bush 41, i.e., you've got to be cold-blooded about the self-interest of your nation. Obama's own use of Reinhold Niebuhr, whose papers are here in the library and whose words echoed throughout his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, also speaks to a conscious invocation of a liberal realist tradition, a phrase also used by Professor Joseph Nye. Thus far, I have used Realpolitik in a conventional sense, that is both positively and pejoratively, and interchangeably with a series of other evocative terms: Machiavellian, cold-blooded, self-interested, realist, and realistic. Yet what I want to argue is that real Realpolitik is more than this. It is one of those words borrowed from another language that is much used but not fully understood. And here I take my cue from the British historian A.J.P. Taylor, who wrote in 1934, of course a crucial year in international relations, that a nation's foreign policy is based upon a series of assumptions with which statesmen have lived since their earliest days, and which they regard as so axiomatic as hardly to be worth stating. It was the duty of a historian, Taylor said, to clarify these assumptions and to trace their influence upon the course of everyday policy. So that is what I hope to do. Realpolitik is not, as is often assumed, as old as statecraft itself, nor is it part of a seamless creed stretching back to Thucydides and running through Machiavelli, Cardinal Richelieu, Thomas Hobbes, up to figures like Hans Morgenthau, George Kennan, and Henry Kissinger himself. Crucially, real Realpolitik was born in an era which more closely resembles that in which we find ourselves today, or at least more closely than the world of Renaissance-era statecraft in which Machiavelli operated. It emerged in mid-19th century Europe from the collision of the Enlightenment with the realities of state formation and power politics. This was a world experiencing the quintessential problems of modernity, a unique combustion of new ideas about freedom and social order alongside rapid industrialization, class antagonism, sectarianism, great power rivalry, and the rise of nationalism. Indeed, the creation of the concept of Realpolitik, I would argue, was an early attempt to answer a conundrum which has been the organizing dialectic at the heart of Anglo-American foreign policy ever since. That is, how to achieve liberal, enlightened goals in a world that does not follow liberal, enlightened rules. The word itself was coined by the German writer Ludwig August von Rochow in his 1853 treatise, The Principles of Realpolitik. Rochow, who added a second volume in 1869 in which he refined some of his earlier arguments, is a largely forgotten figure today, despite the fact that Realpolitik lives on. So who was he? Ludwig August von Rochow, to borrow a loaded phrase, and to do so with some intent, might best be described as a liberal mugged by reality. The illegitimate son of a soldier, he was a publicist, journalist, and a radical member of the Wehrmacht, the movement for liberal political reform in the German states. And the efforts of that liberal movement, like those of their sister movements across Europe, culminated in the rebellions of 1848, which spread across the European continent and were intended to establish constitutional, liberal, representative government. Rochow, who had been in exile in Paris before the uprising and had also visited Italy, returned to Germany and tried to attain a seat in the liberal Frankfurt Assembly, which was established that year. Although he failed, he became a well-known figure in the National Liberal Party and eventually became a deputy in the German Reichstag in 1871. In some respects, and permit me a loose analogy, the 1848 revolutions were 19th century Europe's equivalent of the Arab Spring. Uprisings which began in the name of freedom and constitutional rights swiftly fell victim to other political phenomena. The liberal gains of 1848 were soon lost as they were swatted down by coercive governments, or in many cases, swallowed up by more powerful social forces such as class, religion, and nationalism. Over the following 2 decades, Germany was indeed to be united as the liberals in Germany had hoped, but not by the means that they wished to achieve this. Rather than constitutionalism and representative government, it was the blood and iron of the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck that provided the motor for the creation of the German Empire in 1871. And as Rochow watched the dreams of European liberals go up in smoke, he thought it time for some hard thinking. The castles that they have built in the sky have evaporated into blue mist, he wrote, in a phrase which is very hard to read without turning one's mind to more recent events. A work that had begun with aimless enthusiasm and carried out with an overestimation of one's capabilities ended in dishonor and injury. The great achievement of the Enlightenment, in Rochow's view, had been to undermine the notion that might equals right in politics. The mistakes that liberals had made, however, was to assume that this meant that the law of the strong had suddenly evaporated overnight just because it was unjust. When it became a matter of trying to bring down the walls of Jericho, Rockau wrote, the Realpolitiker thinks that lacking better tools, the most simple pickaxe is more effective than the sound of the most powerful trumpets. We'll turn to Rockau in a moment, but let me say something briefly about the afterlife of Realpolitik, first in Germany and then in the Anglo-American world, which has been the real main focus of my research. In Germany, following Rockau, the concept of Realpolitik was seized upon by the historian and fellow national liberal politician Heinrich von Treitschke, who set out to show the German people, and this is a quote, how brilliant Realpolitik is, and thought Rockau's work, despite being that of a journalist, was worth more than 1,000 books on political theory. But Treitschke's influence and his ideas of racial struggle and war represented an increasingly rightward turn in German liberalism, in which the liberal side of the equation was, if you like, put down the pecking order as compared to the cause of national independence. Whereas Rockau himself remained opposed to Bismarck, Treitschke ultimately fell into his arms and effectively became the historian of the Prussian court and the German national cause. It was thus then, by a strange twist of fate, that the phrase that Rockau had coined in opposition to Bismarck became increasingly associated with the figure of Bismarck himself. It was now used to describe Bismarck's brand of practical and ruthless statecraft in the domestic and international arena, his astute management of different social forces within the state, and there was an element of Rockau in that, but also his ability to combine diplomacy with the use of force in the international arena. By the time of Bismarck's fall from power in 1890 at the hands of the Kaiser, usage of the word was widespread but increasingly detached from its original meaning. For example, it was argued that the Kaiser's desire for imperial glory and colonial expansion, what he called Weltpolitik, world politics, was a megalomaniacal rupture from Bismarck's more cautious Realpolitik in foreign affairs. The Kaiser was rejecting alliances and streaming headlong into a war on two fronts, which was ultimately to destroy Germany after 1914. In the intellectual sphere, taking up the mantle of Realpolitik from Treitschke was Friedrich Meinecke, who became the foremost historian of Machiavellianism and the national interest, and another cheerleader for German expansionism. By the way, a much more subtle thinker, and I would steer anyone, if they're interested in Machiavelli, to his book on Machiavellianism. As the self-professed exponents of German Realpolitik, however, Treitschke and Meinecke had missed a key dimension of Rockau's work, which can be partly linked to Germany succumbing to a more chauvinistic and aggressive form of nationalism. Treitschke and Meinecke styled themselves as unsentimental and tough-minded thinkers, but they were both virulent anti-Semites. And in fact, Rockau had denounced anti-Semitism in German politics, both as a moral wrong and a gross misconception. Because of their social force, wealth, and intelligence, he believed that German Jews were not only entitled to political representation, they were a huge asset to the nation. Anti-Semitism was irrational, therefore. Anti-Semitism was anti-Realpolitik. At this point, the history of Realpolitik could go in a number of directions and into a number of other national stories. Notably, those on the receiving end of German nationalism were the first to become conscious of the term outside the country, or at least what the term had become since Rockau's caveats were swept away in the process of German unification. To give one notable example, Thomas Masaryk, the German-educated founder and first president of Czechoslovakia, who made his name partly in opposing anti-Semitism, put a new twist on Realpolitik. He adopted what might be called a liberal realist strategy in the fight for Czech independence, in which he made his idealism a political asset. As the foreign correspondent of the London Times wrote in the 1920s, this is Wickham Steed, who's a great admirer of Czechoslovakia, he taught that unlike the German notion of Realpolitik, realism in politics consists not of a cynical disregard of principles, but of a scrupulous reckoning with facts, moral and material. That honesty is not only the best policy, but the only safe guide in public as in private life. And that character, not astuteness or trickery, is the first requisite in a statesman. that success, if you like, and this is my twist in this, need not look like Machiavelli's The Prince. Considerations of Realpolitik also featured in early discussions among Zionist intellectuals about what an ideal state of Israel would and should look like. Franz Rosenzweig, a Jewish theologian, German war hero of the First World War, and a student of Meinecke, you can start to see the links, wrote a critique of Realpolitik in 1917 from the Macedonian front as nothing but calculating jingoism. In the same vein was Hans Kuhn, a German-speaking Prague Jew who regarded Masaryk as his inspiration and spent his life alerting the English-speaking world to the malignant influence of Realpolitik and chauvinistic nationalism. On the eve of the Second World War, Kuhn wrote a famous article in Foreign Affairs on the influence of Treitschke in explaining Nazi aggression. So one can see, I hope, how the various strands begin to tie together, drifting from Europe into the Anglo-American world. Rather than get lost in these subplots, however, I want to focus the rest of my remarks on the Anglo-American history of Realpolitik, which, as I say, is the main area of my research focus. From its German origins, Realpolitik seeped into the English language and the Anglo-American conscience in two ways and in two distinct waves. The first was in the slow build-up to Anglo and German antagonism in the late 19th and early 20th century. For Britons, increasingly cautious of threats to their position as the leading global superpower, and here my American friends may notice some themes, Realpolitik, as practiced by Bismarck and then the Kaiser, was an unpleasant and disconcerting discovery. It became a byword for German dastardliness, taken to imply cynical and uncivilized conduct on the international stage, a lack of respect for the treaties and laws which in the British mind provided some semblance of order in global affairs. From 1891, it was used in the English press with ever-increasing frequency as the Anglo-German rivalry began to gather pace. Realpolitik was identified as the cause of a gangrene in German philosophy and intellectual life. The traditions of Goethe and Kant, which had been so admired in England, had been marginalized by what seemed to be a neo-Machiavellian obsession with power and national destiny. In 1895, the Times bemoaned the fact that there were so few survivors of a period when the old-fashioned idealism of the German character had not been superseded by what is now called Realpolitik. And by 1904, as German naval rearmament gathered pace, the Fortnightly Review complained that the German state works exclusively upon a science of self-interest, more definitely methodized than in any other foreign office and applied with more tenacious consistency. If you can detect a certain hypocrisy in this English denunciation of Realpolitik and in condemning rival nations for working in a science of national interest or self-interest, you would not be the first to do so. Not everyone accepted the implication that Realpolitik was a uniquely German phenomenon. In 1902, the radical English economist J.A. Hobson, a huge influence on Lenin ultimately, published Imperialism, a Study, in which he suggested that the growing ambitions of all the great powers, reflected in colonialism and huge military and naval rearmament programs, were all symptoms of the same sickness. As he wrote, it was this greedy type of Machiavellianism, entitled Realpolitik in Germany, where it was made, which has remodeled the whole art of diplomacy and has erected national aggrandizement without pity or scruple as the conscious motive force of foreign policy. Writing for the New York Times in 1914, the Irish socialist playwright George Bernard Shaw pushed the argument further. Let us have no more nonsense about the Prussian wolf and the British lamb, the Prussian Machiavelli and the English evangelist. As for the Kaiser, the British were his great masters in Realpolitik. Despite this, by the end of the war, the dominant narrative in England remained that Realpolitik was a German problem first and foremost, and a scourge of the international system. And in some respects, the whole field of international relations was set up as an antidote to Realpolitik. Realpolitik has been the true and dominating doctrine of every important German statesman, German soldier, and German thinker for 2 generations at least. That was Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, in 1918. Of all the great powers, the United States came last to Realpolitik. Before its entry into the Great War, America was often chided in the English press for its lack of understanding of the true nature of Realpolitik. In 1911, the British writer Sidney Brooks, a regular contributor to Harper's Magazine, suggested that America's understanding of international politics was lacking because of her relative security. He wrote, "Americans live in an atmosphere of extraordinary simplicity, spaciousness, and self-absorption," if I haven't offended you enough. Until, from very boredom, they are forced to make international mountains out of molehills, a diversion which is itself proof enough of their unique immunity from the serious realities of Realpolitik. It was a cruel irony then that Brooks, who became a strong advocate of American entry into the war, was to die on board the SS Tusiana, a luxury liner carrying American troops to Europe in 1918 when it was hit by a German torpedo. Indeed, the exceptional growth of American power in the early 20th century caused Europeans to swiftly adjust their opinions about the American capacity for Realpolitik. They ascribe to us more foresight than we possess, not really realizing how often we have happily blundered into success, how often we have pursued Realpolitik in our sleep, wrote Walter Whale of the New Republic after a visit to Europe in 1916. "We Germans," a Berlin professor recently told me, "write fat volumes about Realpolitik, but understand it no better than babies in a nursery. You Americans," he added, I thought enviously, "understand it far too well to talk about it." President Woodrow Wilson is sometimes painted as the archetypal, naive idealist by modern American exponents of realism. And yet his decisive entry into World War I, coming in the wake of 2 decades of creeping American expansionism, was taken as an example of America's own willingness to enter the realm of power politics and to great effect. Indeed, it was another of Wilson's cheerleaders, like Walter Whale before him, another New Republic writer indeed, Walter Lippmann, who was the first to make a plea for the American people to adopt what he called their own brand of Realpolitik in his 1917 book, Stakes of Diplomacy. Lippmann's version of Realpolitik is worth quoting, if only because one can see the echoes of it in contemporary debates about American foreign policy. He wrote, "If we are to grapple with the issues which distract the world, we have got to enter the theaters of trouble. This, I realize, is a terrifying program to most Americans. It terrifies me. If we wish to let the world go hang, we may be able to defend our shores and establish a kind of hermit security for ourselves, but that security will be precarious. Our only choice is between being the passive victim of international disorder or resolving to be the active leader in ending it." In other words, early American Realpolitik was anti-isolationist and urged a front-footed engagement with the world, and also urged the propping up of the same international order which had benefited English self-interest in the 19th century. Wilsonian internationalism lost, of course, much of its gloss with the collapse of the League of Nations, the rise of fascism, and America's drift back away from Europe again in the interwar years. And even Walter Lippmann, who had supported the war but regarded Wilson's crusade for democracy in the 14 points as a step too far, moved away from this emphasis on front-footed assertiveness on the international stage to a different form of realism, which emphasized a more selective engagement with the world and an emphasis on American restraint, joined from 1945 by Kennan, Aitchison, Morgenthau, and others. And this leads me into the final portion of my lecture, and the second wave I mentioned earlier, the second wave by which Americans ingested another gulp of Realpolitik. Unlike the first gulp of Realpolitik, this one was not mediated through England and English concerns. Both Walter Whale and Walter Lippmann had learned of the term in 1916, attending debates about Britain's position during the First World War. But it arrived from the heart of Germany itself. So this gulp of Realpolitik was of a markedly different flavor. It was brought into America's leading universities, Yale and Chicago in particular, through an influx of German-speaking immigrant intellectuals who fled Germany before 1939. As well as sociologists, this group included, and of course scientists, this group included a raft of uniquely talented historians such as Hajo Holborn, Hans Morgenthau, Fritz Kramer, Felix Gilbert, and Henry Kissinger himself, all of whom were to make an indelible impact on the course of post-war American foreign policy, partly because of their role in training up the post-war American diplomatic elites. And to emphasize the interconnectedness of our story, it is worth noting that Holborn and Gilbert were personal students of Meinecke. And nearly all of these scholars started at least by working on mid-19th century Europe. By the outbreak of the Second World War, then, Realpolitik was sufficiently established in the American political lexicon to no longer need elaborate definition. In 1940, the Journal of American Speech included it in a list of loanwords from Germany which had become increasingly prevalent in the American press in the preceding years, alongside a few other unpleasant imports: Reich, Gestapo, and Putsch. Herein lay the problem, of course. The word itself was not one which an aspiring foreign policy doyen would necessarily want to be associated with. In his 1951 book, In Defense of the National Interest, for example, Hans Morgenthau, a student of Carl Schmitt from Weimar, Germany, largely concealed the German influences in his thought and emphasized an English language canon of realist thinking, which included Hamilton's Federalist Papers and also, and this is what sparked my interest, Lord Castlereagh's work as Foreign Secretary at the time of the Congress of Vienna. Morgenthau's critics, including A.J.P. Taylor, recognized the sleight of hand. A review in The Economist declared his books to be the latest addition to the now considerable American library of sermons based on the theology of Realpolitik. Carl J. Friedrich, another emigre and a theorist of totalitarianism, called Morgenthau's book an American version of the German Realpolitik. In 1952, he was also attacked by the Austrian-American IR theorist Frank Tannenbaum, who stated that the advocates of Realpolitik would sweep away all our beliefs and foolishness, sentimental and moralistic. Even by the time Morgenthau had expanded and refined his views in The Purpose of American Politics, 1960, which he defined, by the way, as the achievement of freedom, yet another emigre, the Marxist intellectual Herbert Marcuse, wrote to him asking what might have driven the theorist of Realpolitik to transcend Realpolitik. Notably, in the 40s and the 50s, it was President Obama's favorite philosopher, Reinhold Niebuhr, who claimed closest to finding a happy medium between what he called the most rarefied heights of constitutional idealism, a la Woodrow Wilson, and the depths of Realpolitik. But the label was hard to shake. And when Bismarck's reputation was revived by historians in the 1950s, A.J.P. Taylor, another biographer, but not a sympathetic one, cited the influence of W.L. Langer, another German-American scholar at Yale in the 1930s, complaining that through him, Realpolitik had been taught to a generation of students who were to determine American foreign policy after the Second World War. There's an important point to make here. Those who had seen World War II had reason to be fearful of the creep of a Realpolitik mentality as something which threatened to debase liberalism, idealism, and the whole essence of the Anglo-American worldview. In his famous text, The Road to Serfdom, Friedrich Hayek wrote that if the West was to convince Germans that there was an alternative to Nazism, it will not do by concessions to their thought. We shall not delude them with the stale reproduction of the ideas of their fathers, which we have borrowed from them, be it state socialism, Realpolitik, or scientific planning. As the Kissinger Chair should perhaps also quote Dr. Kissinger here, reflecting back on these debates in 2010, and I would say with perhaps a weary tone. The advocates of a realist foreign policy are caricatured with the German term Realpolitik, he said, I suppose to facilitate the choosing of sides. The Cold War, and perhaps above all the association with Kissinger, breathed new life into Realpolitik and meant that the term outlasted the bitter debates of the 50s and 60s, though it was associated, of course, with new controversies. Mentions of Realpolitik peaked in the 1970s, both in the press and in diplomatic cables, during the Nixon and Carter administrations. In the 1980s, of course, the advocates of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, such as Jean Kirkpatrick and Irving Kristol, repeatedly described how America had transcended realpolitik, and in doing so had won the Cold War. And they used the term regularly in a pejorative sense. Now, I realize that I'm rushing through the 70s and the 80s, and this is not simply because I'm running to the end of my talk, but also because of the simple fact that the more ubiquitous the use of realpolitik became, the less it really meant anything. And this indeed is one of the themes of the book, that looking at realpolitik in this period and in this way actually tells us more about ourselves than it necessarily tells us about the world around us. So what finally would Ludwig von Rockau have made of all of this? I began by saying that I still thought his original conception of realpolitik was still of relevance to us, so I will end by giving you 2 reasons why. First of all, it provides us with a way of looking at contemporary politics which is deep and rigorous, but not dependent on method or formula. And this, of course, is a historian's instinct here. Rockau was a journalist and not a jurist. For him, realpolitik was not a theory, but, and I quote, a mere measuring and weighing and calculating of political facts that need to be processed politically. It was not without depth either. He was influenced by an eclectic and rather messy range of political philosophy, which included the Scottish Enlightenment, Edmund Burke, and French social theorists of the early 19th century. All of this was simply thrown into the pot and mixed together with a strong dose of history. As he put it himself, realpolitik dealt with the historical product, accepting it as it is, with an eye for its strengths and weaknesses, and remained otherwise unconcerned with its origins and the reasons for its particular characteristics. The second point is that Rockau incorporated the conditions of modernity, mass politics, and the public sphere in his analysis in a way that is entirely understandably absent from Machiavelli. He was, as much as anything else, a theorist of public opinion, for which he used the German term Zeitgeist. And he wrote, things like bourgeois class consciousness, the idea of freedom, nationalism, the idea of human equality, are completely new factors of social life for many of today's states, he wrote. And you can think of the Arab Spring echo again. Realpolitik, he continued, would contradict itself if it were to deny the rights of the intellect, of ideas, of religion, or any other of the moral forces to which the human soul renders homage. Patriotism, for example, was not a delusion or distraction from realpolitik. It was a serious asset to any state trying to carve out a place for itself in the international arena. Not every idea was of equal political importance, of course. It was often the case, Rockau wrote, that the most beautiful ideal that enthuses noble souls is a political nullity. When it came to phantoms or fantasies like eternal peace, international fraternity and equality, with no will and no force behind them, he put it in a very memorable turn of phrase, realpolitik passes by, shrugging its shoulders. On the other hand, he warned that the craziest notion may become a very serious realpolitik matter. And by this, it is worth noting he had in mind both communism and anti-Semitism. Ultimately, then, it is worth ending by noting that the father of realpolitik was a critic of utopianism, not idealism. It was not that his liberal colleagues were ambitious, optimistic, and idealistic that was the problem. It was that they had allowed their critical faculties to atrophy into what he called formless ideas, impulses, emotional surges, melodic slogans, naively accepted catchwords, and habitual self-delusions and the misguided pride which characterizes the human mind. 161 years later, wherever one finds oneself on the political spectrum, these are words, I submit, which are still worth heeding. Thank you very much. I think there's time for questions, and there are a few mics roving around the room. Don't be shy.
in the popular discourse, it often seems that realpolitik is connected with sort of just hardball tactics. You know, most recently, say, Putin. But how do you regard that? I mean, as a component of realpolitik. I mean, is it also possible for something like, say, the Marshall Plan to be realpolitik, even though it's sort of a model of soft power?
I would say absolutely would be my response. And I think a key consideration here is that Rocha, in the first instance, was a theorist, or not a theorist, so he was someone who was analyzing a domestic political scene. So something gets lost as his idea is applied to the international arena. But as someone who analyzed the domestic political scene, he was very cognizant of and very literate about the different social forces and the structures of society. So French social theory, as I say, is a big aspect of what he writes about. The reason why he thinks the bourgeoisie is going to win, ultimately, is not because their ideas are best, necessarily, but that's where social force is grounded and based. So if you were to extend the analogy, and if I was to do exactly what I've been cautioning against and misapplying realpolitik, the Marshall Plan would be a prime example of that. Something that recognizes the structures, shapes, and forces do not necessarily have to exist at the simple sort of military level or the simple Machiavellian level. So I absolutely would be my response.
Hi, Ryan Evans, Center for the National Interest. John, what would you say were Morgenthau's innovations, if anything, or did he just borrow sort of in whole from his German influences? And the second question is, how would you discuss the sort of transition from realism and realpolitik as something that historians studied to something political scientists and IR theorists studied with Waltz?
Both are a question of time and place. First of all, the criticism that Morgenthau was somehow, I said he's concealing the German influences in his thought. The reason why he was doing that, because he was very conscious that it was too easy to dismiss him as a sort of pro-German figure. I mean, Morgenthau is not misty-eyed and sentimental about the Germany he had to flee as a German Jew. Morgenthau is a deeply patriotic American. I think that's a crucial consideration here. And I wouldn't sort of denounce him in any respect in that regard. How innovative his thinking was? Yes, it was innovative, and I don't want to get into sort of the historical aspect of it. I would say that there was an element which I think is perhaps, and this feeds into your second question, historical cherry picking, which I think exists in some forms of international relations theory, where you pick an example or a moment to illustrate your point. And I give as an example his use of Castlereagh. It's not a fully rounded discussion of what Castlereagh is doing. It's a useful way to say that there's an English language way of doing this as well. So as an innovative thinker, there's strong elements of innovation and influenced a whole generation of IR theorists, and I possibly couldn't do that full justice. I would also say, crucially though, he is, like all of the thinkers before him, a product of time and place. And by the way, Meinecke got that more than anyone. Meinecke knew that the role of a historian was, in a sense, to reflect the world around him at that moment in time, and that his ideas were necessarily time-bound and context-bound. I would put Morgenthau into a group of people, and I'd steer you towards Joel Rosenthal's book on this, righteous realists. It's a deeply moral discourse of American realism. Some people say it's realpolitik is somehow cynical and a kind of a mischievous elevation of the national interest. Those post-war American realists had a deeply moral conception in their own way. And part of that reflected internal concerns about the direction of American society. It was internalized reflection. So they're not immoral. I think that's the wrong criticism. I think thereafter, in some respects, they're wrong about certain things. So that's a different debate. So I judge the realists by their own terms rather than by projecting either some sort of German line or anything else like that. And sorry, the second question was?
When it became an IR discipline.
Looking at this whole period, the whole discipline of IR in some ways covers the period of the time I'm talking about. And IR is, first of all, and this is crucial, I talked about Anglo-American worldview, an Anglo-American obsession. It is primarily, a kind of Anglo-American creed. A lot of this emerged, and a lot of the research I couldn't include, in the 20s and in the 30s. with people sort of articulating that IR was to be the antidote to realpolitik. So realpolitik had caused the First World War because of a bad functioning of the way the national interest was applied by states, and it was possible to avoid the type of thing that the First World War had happened. You know, the war was not inevitable in that respect. So IR is very much a product of time and place in that respect. I will say also in the 50s and 60s, you get a sense with a lot of American realists that they always feel they're on the losing side. They always feel that no one's listening to them. I think this is a recurrent thing, that no one gets what they're saying and no one's listening to them. And there's an element of that, and I can almost see this looking at Morgenthau's papers here. He's trying to get his students jobs. He feels that sometimes they're pushed out of the situation. He's complaining that foreign affairs is too Wilsonian, and they never publish him. And there's an element in which they retreat to the academy. And I think that possibly reflects, to a certain extent, the way that IR has been criticized for lacking kind of relevance and present-mindedness. That it's become more of a sort of science or a kind of a theology than necessarily a realpolitik way of looking at things. Yeah. Lots of questions. Gentleman here, and then we'll take Michael and Jonathan.
Sure. Actually, picking up from 2 weeks ago and placing liberalism, which is really where you feel realpolitik is aligned, with neoconservatism, I wonder how you would define the differences between neoconservatism and liberalism as inheritors of the tradition.
This gets us into a minefield for various reasons. And one reason is, I mean, this is a feature of my book, so I'm not going to ignore the minefield. I'll go into it in the manner of a North of Irish soldier at the Somme in 1914. I've considered this a lot. Irving Kristol, if you take him as, you know, pretty much, if you say, you know, if there's a neoconservative thinker, it's Irving Kristol. Irving Kristol had a strange relationship with realpolitik, and I'll tell you why I think this is important. In the 60s, he celebrated it, actually, the word, and he celebrated what he called the Europeanization of our foreign policy. Because in that time he had in mind naive critics of American foreign policy, in his view, people who took their opposition to Vietnam too far in terms of, you know, articulating a sort of different position. So Irving Kristol was receptive to the idea as a kind of counterintuitive response to the sort of prevailing wisdom that he saw in academia. By the 70s and the 80s, and Norman Podhoretz, another neoconservative, claims some credit for this, he is attacking realpolitik as realpolitik à la Disraeli, he says, talking about a 19th century British Prime Minister, as un-American. So he changes his tune in that line. Now, the prevailing reasons he changed his tune, I think, are partly his understanding of where he was at that moment in time in terms of time and place, also domestic politics. And I think this is an aspect of what I want to say more broadly. I mean, neoconservatism is, in the first instance, it arises out of an internal discourse in American politics. That's the bottom line in the 50s and the 60s and prevailing concerns. And of course, it has a foreign policy application, but I think that comes after. But I'd say the same of realism, and that's in a way my point. And it is a point, and you can see it with Britain in the 19th century, that comes from relative luxury and security. Because the other thing about the Anglo-American worldview is that our wars are wars, by and large, wars of choice. Even you could push this to Britain in 1914 and 1939. So that relative security means that, you know, in some respects, our debate on foreign affairs and foreign policy is a luxury. It's not a debate about survivalism. So I've kind of discussed neoconservatism. Perhaps you said, how does liberalism compare to neoconservatism? There's others better equipped to answer that. I'm not sure I could. Yeah, Michael? Yeah, there's a microphone. What's there?
John, you've mentioned Reinhold Niebuhr, who's a favorite, I wouldn't say philosopher, but a theologian of mine, and also the president's. One of the themes he championed and was famous for was the just war theory. So how does that chime with realpolitik?
I mean, Niebuhr, again, German-speaking, and very aware of a lot of the German work I'm talking about as well. not to be confused with I mean, he was an American first and foremost. His father came here early in the 20th century. Just war theory and Niebuhr in particular, I think Niebuhr's influence is the biggest influence on the discourse of a 20th century American foreign policy thereafter from the 40s and 50s. And it's not so much necessarily, I mean, he wrote about everything, right? I mean, huge amounts in the Library of Congress. I gave up after a few weeks in the manuscript room. I couldn't go any further, and others have done it better. He wrote specifically about certain foreign policy episodes and prescribed them and did in the context of just war. The key thing about Niebuhr is the way he talks about American foreign policy and the way he talks about the responsibility of foreign policy and the willingness to resist evil on the one hand and the need to exercise restraint on the other. And I said at the start of my remarks that Rochow pointed to the organizing dialectic of American foreign policy. So how Anglo-American foreign policy, how to achieve good as a theologian would want to in a world that sometimes where you try to achieve good, you end up achieving bad. That's kind of the problem. And his influence on the president kind of wraps it nicely in a circle for me, because a lot of this debate is theological. And this relates to my previous question. It's about having a coherent worldview. So if neoconservatism or American realism comes out of America in the first instance about domestic political considerations, it's essentially an attempt to find what the president's using, the way the president's using Niebuhr is an attempt to find an articulate, coherent worldview. Okay, and we like to do that in the West. This is partly because of the influence of Protestant theology. We like to have an articulate, coherent worldview. But that's a theological viewpoint rather than necessarily a realpolitik viewpoint. It's not necessarily reflective of how the world looks around you. It's reflective of how you want to square the circle, if you like. I'd say a great deal of international relations shares that theological instinct to categorize and to theorize at that meta level. There's two questions back here.
So you mentioned in your talk that there was a distinction at first. Some people drew a distinction between Bismarck's Realpolitik and the Kaiser's Weltpolitik, but by the time World War I starts, people are using Realpolitik to describe what the Kaiser is doing. So I guess the question comes fundamentally down to, is Realpolitik, is it more, how do I phrase it? Is it the problem with Realpolitik, do more people view it in this calculating way, or is it the problem that people have is they view it in this aggressive way that got applied to World War I, more or less? So what would you say? Is it calculating or aggressive?
I think you can see both in both of those tendencies. So there are subtle, and a lot of times the genuine experts on Germany are saying this in the 1920s and the 30s. You don't understand what it really meant. So I think both those threads are what exist, and they exist throughout my book and will exist throughout my book. The positive interpretation of it as calculating and therefore useful to how you approach politics. As an antidote to naivety, a corrective to naivety, you have to be realistic about the world. Wilson got it wrong, he got too naive on one hand. And on the other hand, those who say no. Because when you're correcting liberalism too much, when you're compromising it too much, you will lead down a path in which anti-Semitism becomes okay, in which you essentially elevate the national interest and cynicism so much, you forget about a higher ideal. And by the way, these are the sort of terms, precisely the sort of the issues that Meinecke wrestles with after the First World War. He discusses this in length, and he wants to find a kind of a compromise between the two. But again, a lot of that, as Realpolitik in the 70s and 80s, the later part of this last century, it becomes a political football. So that kind of, it loses that meaning. But those two threads actually do exist simultaneously throughout the 19th century. So as the debate goes, people say, Realpolitik bad. And then German emigres say, you don't understand what it is. It's more subtle than that. And then people like H.A.B. Taylor, who did understand what it is, or Tannenbaum, critics of totalitarianism, say, no, we do understand what it is. We know you're not crazy. We know you're trying to call for Bismarck and not the Kaiser, but it's still a problem because it leads to a creep and a sickness within liberalism. And by the way, that was the most smart criticism of Rochow comes from a German Christian writer called Constantin Franz, and he says precisely that. This is my problem with Realpolitik. that it causes, it perverts the very essence of liberalism. Because liberalism is not about success, it's about a Christian spirit of benevolence. That's what Franz says. So people identify this early on. Here's the issue with his philosophy. Yeah, Tom in the middle there. Yeah, I know. Come on. Yeah, last one. Sorry.
I'm struck by your comment about the sorrows and the frustrations of realpolitikers in the Anglo-American tradition, and even as they move into the academy, the frustrations of them. You had to begin your story someplace in time. I'm wondering if you would entertain the idea that...
I know where you're going with this.
Okay, okay. You knew where I was going before I asked the question. If you would entertain the idea that at least it was an uphill slog even before the mid-19th century, that there was an Anglo-American strategic culture that was inhospitable to this fundamental way of thinking that has sort of always left realpolitikers out in the cold, lamenting the sorrows of empire.
You could put, one reason is, as you know, Tom, from the Elizabethan period, you could put that back to, I think the fact that these are Protestant nations and laterally evangelical nations in the 19th century is a key critical component. And that makes the sort of German departure slightly intriguing as well, because also a Protestant nation. So that's a key aspect of it. The way the Enlightenment impacted these nations as well, I think, is another important aspect of this. Exactly. You could take A.J.P. Taylor's The Troublemakers, which is about the sort of critics and opponents of prevailing foreign policy wisdoms, and you could push it back right to the Elizabethan period. And I wrote about Castlereagh, who was constantly, and I think hounded to his death, by the critics of his foreign policy for being too realpolitik, too cynical, and that Britain should be more than that, and more ideological than that. I would say it's the irreducible core, and you can never eradicate that instinctive core in the way that Britain and America conduct their foreign policies. Also, I think for a strategically self-interested reason, which is that they are relatively secure island nations whose interest it is to have a world system crafted in their image. Now, the argument is, of course, well, of course you want democracy, free trade, and freedom of waterways, but it suits us, and there is a good argument in that. So it's both the context and the sort of ideological history. 100% agree, though, that Anglo-American strategic culture, call it what you will, much predates all the period I'm talking about. I think I've got the nod. I have to end it there, so I'll hand back over to Jason.
We do have to end it there, unfortunately. I just want to remind you that this event was filmed, as were our previous two in this series, and they will be on the library's website and YouTube channels in the coming weeks and months. Please do sign up for our list in the back to get notified of when they are available, and we can continue the conversation at the reception in the back. Please join us. Thanks again.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.